Hey, this is Jeff. Grab yourself a cup of coffee and join us at the table as we talk to another great leader about faith, church, and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Drip.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Leadership Drip, and we have an exciting show today. I think maybe for the first time on the podcast, actually flying solo, but not completely solo, because I have a great friend with me, Rich Villodas, who's on the show today. He is the pastor of New Life Fellowship in Queens, New York. Let's hear it for New York, all my people out there. He's the author of the book, Deeply Formed Life, which just most recently came out. It's a fantastic conversation, and that is what we're going to be focusing on today. So, Rich, welcome to the show, man.
Robert, so good to be here. Look forward to a good conversation.
Absolutely. Well, let's get first things first. So, we have a lot of people on the show here from either the Chicago area or the New York area, right? So like our friend Durso was on the show, like he's a New York guy, right? You're a New York guy. We got all kinds of people. So it's always a conversation about pizza.
Of course.
Like you already knew what was coming.
I know where this is going. Yeah.
So okay. I mean, are you going to step across the line? Do you enjoy a good Chicago style pizza, or are you straight New York?
No, I enjoy it. I enjoy it, but priorities matter. And so I have no hate against it, but New York through and through, and give me a New York slice any day of the week.
Awesome. Okay, so now I've got to ask, what's your favorite pizza in New York? 'Cause I've got to come back to New York at some point. It's been a while since I've been in the city, and I need a good New York pizza. Yeah,
so many places. In Queens, there are two places. One place called Lillian's Pizza, which Ray Romano used to live in Forest Hills part of Queens, and his pictures are all over that pizzeria. There's a great place called Nick's Pizza, which is in another part in Forest Hills, Queens, which is phenomenal. And then there's a spot in Long Island called Geno's. And for me, at least, they have the best buffalo chicken slice ever eat. It's phenomenal. So
you even step outside of the box a little bit with the buffalo slice. Now, I'm a traditionalist. Like, I judge most restaurants by classic dishes. So if I go to an Italian restaurant, if you don't have good lasagna, I'm not coming back. Right? If I go to a pizza place, you don't have good pepperoni pizza, I'm not coming back. I mean, so I'm kind of clean and simple like that. But you're trying this buffalo sauce, it's kind of throwing me off a little bit.
Yeah. That's just, they have the regular sliced pizza as well, the regular cheese slice, which is phenomenal. But that buffalo slice is out of this world.
Okay. I'm gonna take your word for it. Well, that's the pizza conversation. So I guess we'll get to the good stuff now, right? The good stuff of the conversation. Hey, this book, and we'll get to the book here in a little bit, but I think, for our listeners, I think it's really important for them to hear some of your story, which is just an incredible story of how you grew up as a kid in Brooklyn. Not really going to church other than with your grandparents, when they took you, those kinds of things. So, but in your teen years, you really sort of had this family encounter with God, you know what I mean? So why don't you kind of walk us through that experience a little bit and kind of tell us about that day?
Yeah. As you mentioned, from time to time, I would go to a small Pentecostal Spanish speaking church in Brooklyn with my grandparents. My parents were not Christian growing up. They were quite indifferent and apathetic to the things of church and Christianity. But because that Pentecostal church had 3 and 4 hour services, you get good childcare for those services there. So my parents were saying, go to that church, not the Catholic one, go to that one where you get 3 and 4 hour services. We need a break. And so I would attend that church. And by the time I was 12 or 13, asked my parents if I could stop attending. They said yes, and then found myself back in there as a 17-year-old because I started dating an Assemblies of God pastor's daughter. And so that got me back into church very quickly, and didn't need to pray about it. So I was like, he said, the only way you can date my daughter is if you go to church. I was like, I'll be there. So went there for a few years. The relationship came to an end after a couple of years, and in great teenage heartbreak, anxiety mode, found myself just heartbroken and needing some form of healing. And when I got home one August night in 1999, I found out that my 4 younger siblings were at this church that I used to attend when I was a kid. which was strange because we never went to church as a family at
Yeah.
all. And so there was some guest evangelists there. I decided I'm all broken up. Maybe I should go there as well. So I went to that church. Some preacher got up and started preaching from Ezekiel 37, which, I mean, you just could read the passage. You don't even have to preach it,
That's
and lives are going to be changed. And
that's
so
right.
he preached on the valley of dry bones and God breathing life, and essentially said, if you want this breath of life, come up and receive it. We want to pray for you. And somehow my parents ended up at the church. They followed me as I went into the church some 15 minutes later. So my parents were there, a number of family members were there, and one by one, we all received Christ that night, about 15 of us,
Amazing.
one night in this storefront church in Brooklyn. And so that's how my journey of following Christ began as a 19-year-old. And here I am 22 years later, trying to follow Jesus faithfully in the world.
Man, I love that story. Now, I've heard that story before. I mean, when you were here at Lee and you spoke, you shared a little bit of it as well. And I think it's just a great testimony to the family dynamics, which I think apply, specifically towards this deeply formed life conversation. I do have sort of a funny story, a kind of a cultural sort of collision story. So where I pastored in Washington, D.C., there was also a Spanish congregation that met there. We decided to have this really great, unified, multicultural service one Sunday, and all of us come together. And I asked this Puerto Rican Pentecostal preacher to come and share his testimony because it was phenomenal. He was a gangbanger in Puerto Rico, like went to prison, got saved. I mean, it was a phenomenal story, right? So he's like, yeah, I'd love to come and preach, right? So I asked him to come. He comes and he speaks. And like 2 hours into his message, he says, this is no lie. He says, Pastor asked me to share my testimony, so I'm going to try to share my testimony. I was like, all of us poor, starving white people in the congregation were just like, but it was amazing. It truly was an amazing service, and I loved it. It was incredible.
When we talk here, I mean, I'm Puerto Rican as well. That 30 minutes, that's the preface to the prayer. So
Right.
I get it.
Oh man, that was great. So another really cool sort of facet to your journey is there's a guy that you obviously know way better than I do. I've never actually had the personal privilege to meet him, though I've read all of his stuff. Peter Scazzaro, emotionally healthy spirituality, emotionally healthy leadership. Just an incredible writer, incredible thinker, incredible theologian, incredible pastor. Obviously, he's played a significant role in your life and your development because you actually succeeded him as pastor at his church. So a lot of things that we talk about on the show is the importance of this mentoring relationship, both the traditional sort of models conversations from the top down, but we also talk a lot about the reverse mentoring where we are mentored from the bottom up, younger people mentoring us. So I would love to kind of hear a little bit more about your and Pete's kind of relationship, how that evolved, and how you succeeded him in ministry.
Yeah, when I got to New Life 12 years ago, I was 28 years old, and I didn't have a clue that he was going to be in a succession process. So I went to New Life just to be on the preaching team to oversee small group ministry. And about 2 years after getting there, he let me know, hey, I'm in a succession plan. I'm like, I came here because of you. And
Right.
he's saying, I'm about to step out of this senior pastor position. Would you like to go through a process with us? And so the first thing I learned from him is how deliberate and thorough and contemplative and prudent his leadership was, thinking ahead, considering all the various factors and variables that go into big leadership decisions, not rushing through. And so that's the first thing that I learned from him as a 28-year-old, that there was a 4-year thorough process of succession and transition. And it was in that time where I started working very closely with him. I was leading behind the scenes staff meetings and starting to preach more, and learned from him probably the greatest leadership lesson beyond just his own integrity and his own character was the importance of holding on to particular values and leading from values, not expediency, not efficiency, not for the sake of just results, but we're going to be driven by a particular set of values informed by the gospel and contextualized in our space in Queens. And it was in that place where those few years where I got to see up close the challenges of leadership. It was a gift because, as the lead pastor and senior pastor, not everyone likes you all the time. And so, I'd say most of the time, for the most part, I've received much more commendation and affirmation than I have criticism. But when criticism comes, it can hurt. And so I remember him in the waning years of just his tenure as the senior pastor, and as I was stepping in, that there were some people that wanted to address things with him. And he would say, "Hey, Rich, would you like to join me in these meetings just to sit on the side, be a fly on the wall, and watch me engage these people?" And I said, if they are fine with that, I'd love to do that. And there were a number of those conversations where I was just in the room as he was receiving, whether it was criticism, but the way he was receiving it from a non-anxious place, from a place of curiosity, from a place of empathy, from a place of wanting to really understand and then speak out, whether it was his perspective or why he's making decisions the way he is. To be a part of that, really, he modeled something for me about non-anxious presence, and that leadership requires a non-anxious presence, especially in a world that's marked by deep polarization and conflicts and disagreements. So beyond just that lesson there's so many other lessons I'm happy to go into with Pete, but the importance of letting our values lead us, the importance of non-anxious presence, the importance of being prudent and thinking things through and considering the various ways that or possibilities of various decisions. I've tried to take that with me as I've been the lead pastor of New Life over the past 8 years.
Yeah, and I think those are such key. I mean, each one of those are probably books or dissertations in and of their own right, of course. I mean, and I think, certainly you have been around enough circles and understand enough and have seen enough to know that succession plans are not necessarily the forte of good church leadership, right? It's not something that I think we have done very well. And I don't think that's out of some kind of egotistically driven sort of, mode or dark place in the heart all the time. Maybe certainly some cases it is, but I think it's just a lack of understanding and knowledge of how to do that well. Why do you think that maybe, because we have a lot of young adult leaders who are listening, who are anxious to get started, who are anxious to step in and provide ideas and insights and innovations into local church ministry. And then you've got the older generation, just for a lack of better terminology, just the older generation who are slower to adapt, slower to change. So what is some of the tension in the poor succession planning that we're seeing in our churches today?
I think at the core of it, and what we experienced at New Life, is number one, a team-based approach to ministry and leadership. Long before the succession came into place, Pete had launched the preaching team to basically say, we're not just going to live off, our congregation is not going to live off of my sermons and my leadership. We need other voices here that our congregation can learn from. And so he opened that up. Additionally, what made succession possible was we had a structure of sabbaticals every 7 years and for 4 months. And so every 7 years that came, he went on a 4-month sabbatical, and that communicated a few things to the church. Number one, we can exist without him. Now, did we love him? Yeah. Do we want him to be here? Absolutely. But again, this church is built on Jesus Christ. This church is not built on this personality, which is why, I had my first sabbatical 2 years ago after being 7 years in the role. And so that was a really significant aspect of it as well. So moving out of the personality-driven aspects of what leadership can be. But I think some of the other areas that made it work was Pete's own self-awareness. He knew the difficulty of letting go. Now, he did something that was not a bit not strange, but is not typical in that he transitioned when he was 57 years old.
Yeah.
So he's, folks are usually in their 60s and 70s before pastors say, all right, I'm going to transition out of this role. He transitioned out of the role at about 56, 57. And so, and that was because the Lord was leading him to some other things and he wanted to be open to that. But even though he willingly wanted to hand it over, he did some significant inner work, recognizing the ways that he's so emotionally connected to this leadership role, to the power that he has. Not that it's a bad thing, but he recognized the power, the influence, what it meant to be the leader of this community. And so I remember meeting with him throughout the course of the succession every week for a number of hours, and he would just talk about what it means to let go and the work that he's been doing with his therapist on letting go and what it means in the season. So part of it was just that self-awareness and the vision for the future. Recognizing there are younger leaders in our midst. How do we position those younger leaders well and appropriately for the sake of the future? So that was our context. I recognize different contexts are different, but
Sure.
those are some of the undergirding principles that helped us to have what I believe is a very successful transition.
So to this conversation then, and I think over the course of the podcast that we've done in the last year and a half, we've had some incredible conversations with incredible leaders. But I think one of the major sort of themes that keep reoccurring when it comes to young adults, leading young adults, engaging young adults in the local church, keeping young adults in the local church, is this conversation that you're talking about, which really is about the book, but it's also sort of been modeled for you through Pete's leadership, is this conversation of self-awareness and the willingness to do the deep soul work that's required in order for you to get to those healthy spaces and places so you can make the kinds of decisions in leadership that are beneficial not only for you personally, but beneficial for the whole body. So there's been kind of this surge in recent years. Biola, where I went in California, they have a full spiritual formation discipleship program. It's popping up in different conversations and circles in local churches. You can become now a professional spiritual formation discipleship counselor, right? There's all kinds of these new sort of spiritual formation conversations popping up, but spiritual formation is obviously not a new concept because it's a biblical one. Yeah. So maybe some things are obvious, maybe they aren't. Maybe this is just a stem from the mental health crisis we're all facing, especially in our Western American context. But what seems to you sort of the spiritual soil that's being toiled behind the scenes by God that's bringing these things back into light?
Yeah, I think some of it is the social media is making more obvious or making more clear some of our deficiencies in leadership and in character formation. And so whether it's being seen in leading pastoral and church leaders having these falls from grace, in the 80s and 90s, someone would fall from grace, moral failure, and you might read it in an article on Christianity Today, and that was about it. Nowadays, it's all over the place. It's going viral with a level of speed that we've never seen before. And so because of this rapid change and this rapid accessibility that we have to technology and information, I think it's accelerating and exposing the cracks of the ways that we're thinking about what it means to follow God in this world, what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, what it means to be a leader. And so I see all these things as, yes, the Holy Spirit is bringing some things to the surface and inviting us into saying, into living what does it mean to live deeply formed? What does it mean to live a life marked by character, moving beyond efficiency, moving beyond the various metrics that we have often used to define what success is. And what we're finding is those metrics, which is often bigger, better, larger, are not deep enough for the sake of our own sustainability and witness to Christ. So I think the formation, and formation very simply it is that process of becoming like Jesus Christ. If you want to just make it as clear as day, It's Paul saying in Galatians, I'm in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. That's spiritual formation, the
Right.
process of Jesus Christ being formed in us. But it's so easy to miss that emphasis in leadership and in pastoring and the work that we give ourselves to.
It's an interesting, and I think all of us are somewhat exhausted, not only with the pandemic itself, but with conversations about the pandemic. But the longer this kind of extends, and I know New York probably, maybe even more than any other state in the country, really suffered a heavy kind of toll as a result of the pandemic, which really obviously shifted things for you local church ministry wise, because at the end of the day, you're a pastor, right? You're in charge of a flock, a congregation, and this is what you do primarily. And so these conversations about the pandemic, though, and we recently had Sharon Hottie Miller on, and she talked a lot about how they planted a church in the pandemic, which is basically a church made of small groups, right? That's kind of the formation of the local church. So for you guys there in Queens and New York, how has the pandemic sort of either sharpened or reshaped some of your emphasis and your focus on this need for deep discipleship?
Yeah, initially, we had some things in place like live stream before the pandemic began. And so on some level, it was a pretty seamless transition for us to say, okay, Sundays are going to be very different now. And so that's been the biggest challenge for us, has been probably on what's happening on Sundays, keeping a level of engagement, keeping a level of participation, a sense that we're in this together, especially when we're watching from our living rooms or our bedrooms or from the kitchen or from, park outside in the street, whatever it is. So that's been one of the biggest points of challenge and my greatest source of anxiety as a pastor, because Sunday was a space to have little check-ins. I see someone walking in the lobby before they head out. I'm able to say, hey, are you still looking for a job? Hey, how's your daughter doing? Hey, are you feeling better? Those conversations are not being had anymore. So that's been pretty challenging, but we did make a significant and I think an intentional shift to take all of our community life in terms of small groups and utilize platforms like Zoom. And we did it pretty early and invited people into it. And I think for us, people responded very quickly because they were craving community and craving just some form of connection. We also took our emotionally healthy discipleship course that we do. We have two courses on emotionally healthy spirituality and emotionally healthy relationships. And we decided just to put it all on Zoom as well. And what we've discovered is, because at the end of the day, when you finish the church meeting, you're able just to roll into bed and go to sleep. And what we've discovered is we've had the best amount of attendance and engagement that we've ever had in any of these courses. And so we made some shifts pretty early. Now, is it ideal? No. The challenge of Zoom and all that is you can't have these polycentric conversations happening simultaneously. It's often, you better mute yourself and let somebody else talk. And so we miss that. At the same time, there is a lot of formation and discipleship that can happen on these platforms. And so for us, is it ideal? Definitely not. But I do sense the Spirit leading us to continue to deepen this hybridity of ministry in this particular, cultural moment that we find ourselves in.
And that's really good. And I think some of those conversations are just continuing echoes as well. Now, from a leadership perspective, I'm also very curious, about staff and volunteer engagement and things like that, because as a leader, I'm going to be a bit transparent here. My personality is, the pandemic has been difficult for me because I'm a very social person.
Yeah.
Right. And so I have found myself literally emotionally all over the map. Like there are days where I'm like deep into God and I'm journaling and I'm writing and I'm praying and I'm reading. And then there are days that I'm like, I don't want to get out of bed. I'm wearing Crocs and socks for 3 straight days. I mean, it's a disaster, right? So how have you, from a leadership perspective, been able to keep yourself personally and your teams kind of motivated and engaged and you know, really kind of healthily processing the changes?
You know, part of what we've done, I think, and this comes out of the culture that I stepped into, that Pete had begun to plant and cultivate, and my job has been to water that particular culture. Because at the beginning of the pandemic in March, there was a lot of talk of, we can still push forward, we can still be the church, we can still take that mountain. And in our context, what we were hearing, I think, from what we learned in, you know, through Pete and just the kind of monastic approach that we wanted to take at New Life, is actually we probably need to slow down. Actually, we probably need to give ourselves a lot of grace. Actually, we probably need to not take that mountain and actually take a nap. So what we've discovered, and that doesn't mean that it has been easy. I mean, the first few weeks, I was so disoriented with what was happening. I was having nightmares. I was waking up middle of the night. Many people were dying in Queens. We were hearing the ambulance pass by us. It felt like 20 times a day, just nonstop. It felt the sirens, because there's a hospital, Elmhurst Hospital, which was at that time the epicenter of the pandemic in the United States. That's a mile and a half from where we live. And so we were hearing it nonstop. I was having nightmares and such. And in that, I didn't have the margin to say, let's take the next mountain. For me, I realized I better take another nap. I better talk to my therapist. I better get with some pastors. And one of the things that I did was, even before the pandemic, I knew I needed 3 other pastor friends in a very similar space to meet with for 90 minutes once a month. We're in our 3rd year doing it. And I just realized we better not skip that meeting on our calendar, because we need a space to confess. We need a space to pray for one another. So for me, I think the temptation around us was keep pushing, take the mountain. But I think we've learned, no, what we need is a Sabbath. What we need is to pause. What we need to is to try to understand the implications of what's happening before us. So, and even with that, there are good days and there are bad days. So
Yeah.
I'm with you.
Well, I don't know if you got to the Crocs and socks phase, but it was it was scary, right? So no, I appreciate you sharing that. But yeah, so okay, so let's jump back towards the book a little bit. Again, it just recently came out a few months ago, and it's called The Deeply Formed Life. And for some of our listeners, they may be kind of new to the conversations of formation or discipleship. You know, these heavier, more maybe even, slightly more academic terms, right? We don't always use these kinds of terms in church.
Yeah.
Maybe we should be. But you've been in a good Pentecostal service, and right. So we know what that's like. Right?
That's exactly right.
But anyway, so let's talk about deeply formed life. Kind of give us sort of the what God birthed in you, that burden, and sort of how it evolved and where it is now.
Yeah, the Deeply Formed Life came out of really pastoral concern, and what I believed was a ambitious reframing of what spiritual formation is for our generation. And the 5 values that I write about are contemplative rhythms, racial reconciliation, interior examination, sexual wholeness, and missional presence. What many people don't know is those are the 5 values of our congregation. Although we use different language, we call it monastic, multiracial, emotional health, marriage to Christ, and missional. What I wanted to do was try to find language that was a bit accessible to people outside of our context. And because our context is so diverse, over 75 nations represented, multi-generational, multi-class, international congregation, I thought whatever we wrestle with here and write about here is probably going to have an impact outside of our context because of how diverse our community is. But I wrote it because I was having many conversations in the lobby after church or after I teach a class, and people saying, can you tell me more about ways to move forward with race? Or can you tell me more about how spirituality and sexuality converge? Can you tell me more about various practices of justice or contemplation? And so much like Eugene Peterson, when he translated the message, it came out of pastoral concern. He wanted his people to understand what Paul was saying in the book of Galatians. So he decided to write accessible language for his people because he wanted to be a good pastor to them. For me, same thing. It was, I want to be a good pastor to the people that God has entrusted me to serve. I want to translate some of these things, make it accessible, offer theology, and at the same time, humbly but ambitiously say to the church around us, hey, I think this might be a new framework for us to think through what it means to follow Jesus in this particular generation and cultural moment. So, but that was the impetus essentially. Started local, but with a sense that this can go beyond just our local context.
Yeah, and I just want to underscore. I think the message of the book is so timely. These very intense conversations that are wrapped in so many different cultural layers and confusions, and it's really important for us to be able to unpack them and to think through them and to pray through them and to rest in them, in the tension, through the tension, all of these things. So the book itself is so timely. One of the things you say in this book, in which I thought was just a great quote, is, what good are the supernatural changes we make if we neglect the deep work God wants to do inside of us? And I think on a college campus, obviously, coming from a Pentecostal denominational heritage and background here at Lee, we have done a really, really good job of emphasizing and I want to say hyper focusing, but certainly, relishing in this supernatural work of God, which is true, which is legitimate, which we affirm and we're in agreement with, right? God does supernatural things, but we have, as Pentecostals, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit more, not necessarily done the greatest job at the deep stuff, like those kinds of things. So I love the quote. So maybe you can just unpack that for a second.
Yeah, when I think about formation, discipleship, following Jesus in this world, I've been impacted by multiple streams and traditions of Christian faith.
Right.
I think every stream has their gift and they have their gap, their gift and their shadow side. Mm-hmm. And the three particular streams that I've been impacted by have been the evangelical, Pentecostal, and kind of like the mainline progressive traditions. Like I've been in many of those spaces. And I have found that in the evangelical tradition, the emphasis is often on right thinking. In the Pentecostal charismatic tradition, it's often the emphasis is on right experiences. Mm-hmm. And in the progressive kind of mainline tradition, it's often right action, right justice in the world and all that. And what I was thinking as I was wrestling with the ways that I've been formed and shaped, what are the gifts that all these traditions offer? And then what are the gaps that they have as well? And with each of these traditions, the major gap or a major gap has been this lack of interiority, this lack of integration, this lack of integrity. And by integrity, what I mean is not living something perfectly, but wrestling with something faithfully. That's integrity for me. And so whether it's right thinking, right experiences, right action, I want all that. At the same time, I want to give Christ access to the entirety of my being, so that I am addressing matters of race from a deeper place, so that I'm addressing matters of mission and evangelism from a deeper place, so that I'm addressing matters of sexuality from a more thoughtful, reflective, contemplative, integrated place. And we know how it is. It's very easy to split ourselves, the outside from the inside. The deeply formed life is not about ignoring the ways we give ourselves to the world or ignoring the experiences that the Spirit longs to give us and encounter us with, but it is about that integration, that intersection, that integrity, that congruence that I believe the Lord is calling us into, because Christ wants to impact every facet of our being.
And I think, I mean, that's so critical, because the integration conversation in and of itself, maybe even especially on college campuses, is a challenging conversation, because we are not the local church, right? That is not our MO, even though we have some commonalities and some crossover sort of expressions that we say are similar, for example, chapel. But the thing is, the integration piece is so critical to have, because a nursing student or a business student or a math major still needs to know what faith integration looked like. How, what is God saying through the teaching of math?
Yep.
What is God saying through the practice of nursing or medical practice in general, right? So this faith integration piece, which is required to do that deep intrinsic soul work in order for us to really grasp it and to understand it and to live it, is largely missing, not only from the religious sort of Christian church conversation, but also from the academic curricular focus, I think, in a lot of our Christian universities. And I know you speak on campuses and you teach classes. So is this something that you're seeing as well?
Absolutely. And I think the invitation that Jesus gives us is one that is not just people hear deeply formed life and they think navel gazing. They think, all right, he's going to be stuck within, I'm going to be trapped within myself and self-absorbed myself.
Mhm.
When really it is about, yes, looking within and interiority, but that word as well, that integration. How do I now incorporate and show the layers of intersection with what I give myself to, whether it is my vocation, which is why on the chapter that I write on missional presence, at New Life, we don't use the phrase full-time ministry. Like we don't use the phrase like someone says, I can't wait to quit my job so I can go into full-time ministry.
Mhm.
We don't, that language is banned at New Life. And sometimes people still use it and we go,
Yeah.
right. But in our context, everyone is in full-time ministry,
Right.
whether you're a barber, whether you're a nurse, whether you're a firefighter, police officer, everyone is in full-time ministry in service to Jesus and to the world around them. And it is that intersection that there is no secular sacred divide, that Christ is Lord over everything and invites us to submit all of our lives and offer the work of our hands, the attitude of our hearts to him. And I've noticed that compartmentalization, really, it's a formational compartmentalization
Mhm.
that impacts whether the campus or the church, that I'm trying to resist, to say, no, it all belongs to God. It all belongs to Jesus. There is no secular spiritual divide in the ways that we typically understand that.
Yeah. You also quote one of my favorite theologians, N.T. Wright, in your book, and I think this particular quote is fantastic, where he says, "It is only when we slow down our lives that we actually catch up with God."
Love that.
And this college campus that we're on, and what the pressures are that these students are facing. I mean, I cannot tell you how many students I have come into my office. There are two major counseling conversations I have. The first one is typically some sort of sexual identity or sexual confusion kind of conversation on the regular, right? That's a big one. The second one is a vocational discipleship conversation, about what does it mean to be called? How am I called? Am I called? Can I honor God by being a healthcare administration worker? Is
Mm.
that ministry? I mean, these vocational conversations. And I love what N.T. Wright says, which you obviously quote, is that when we actually slow down, we actually catch up with what God is doing. And I think this conversation of flourishing, maybe even in the midst of exile, which is a lot of the stuff that I'm reading from N.T. Wright right now is on exile, but this flourishing, this repentance, this redemption, this restoration that comes from slowing down. I think that's such an important conversation to have, especially on a college campus.
The pace that we live, whether on the campus or in the city, is unrelenting. And this
Yeah.
is not just a New York City thing. This is, New York City might be where the original gene or whatever, where it started, but this is not just a Queens, New York City thing. This is infecting everyone around the world. And that quote from N.T. Wright came out of a video talking about slowness, and he referred to this Japanese theologian named Kosuke Koyama, who
Mhm.
wrote a book called The 3 Mile an Hour God. And the emphasis was that we need to learn how to walk at God's pace if we're going to be able to commune with God. And his argument was, how fast does God walk? And he said 3 miles an hour, because that's the average pace of a human being as they're walking, 3 miles an hour. And so he said that's the pace that God. And so Wright picks up on that and says, well, we better slow down if we want to catch up to God. Good paradoxical thinking there. But I think he's right. It is only when we're able to do that work of slowing down our outer pace so that we can pay attention to our inner space and how the Holy Spirit is looking to speak to us and have us discern. I don't know how we're going to live wise, spirit-filled, prudent lives without that level of slowing down. We see it in Jesus. We see it throughout the scriptures of space is needed for solitude and silence and prayerfulness. We cannot afford to pray as we're going from one class to the next. We can't afford to pray as we're walking to work. Our souls are desperately need unhurried, unfrenzied space to commune with God. And so that's the essence of what Wright is saying. If we're going to catch up to God, we need to learn to slow down. And it is a crucifixion to do it, because I'm thinking, look at everything I'm not getting done. Look at everything that's on my to-do list. And so it is a crucifixion. But on the other side of that crucifixion of slowing down, I do believe there's resurrection waiting for us, because the life of God can be infused in us in an unhurried, unfrenzied space.
I think it's an interesting sort of perspective to take, because whether it's the tyranny of the urgent or a lie from the enemy himself, whatever your particular way you want to blame it, the fear, which that ought to be your first indicator right there that you're on the wrong path, right? The fear is if we don't address quickly, or if we don't speak loudly now, or if we don't engage, and I think maybe this even played out very, very well from our in negative components, certainly, but in this previous election and many of the dynamics that were associated with that, right? But I think the fear is if we don't take charge, then we lose ground. But in actuality, when we're talking in the kingdom and we're talking about in the spiritual economy of things, it's in the slowing down that we actually make greater strides, have greater impact, do greater things for Jesus. Thus, Ezekiel chapter 37 is what you were talking about earlier. Jeremiah chapter 29, not just verse 11, all the other stuff that goes into Jeremiah 29, right? All of those things as well. And so the slowing down piece, then, how do we do that against the grain of culture that just demands that we speak or die?
I think what I've learned about this, which goes against American sensibilities of individualism, is in order to slow down in a way that is sustainable, in a way that's intentional, it does require a particular culture that we are a part of. Now anyone could just take it on themselves and say, I'm going to slow down. I'm going to spend a little more time in prayer, a little more time journaling, a little more time reflecting on the decisions I'm making, analyzing the particular conundrum of this social, political situation we find ourselves in. And they might make progress. But I've discovered, especially being part of a local church, that what enables this slowing down is that I'm part of a larger body in which we are holding one another accountable. So for example, every third Wednesday of the month, we have a pastoral day alone with God. I'll just talk from our pastoral perspective. Now, this was put in before I became the lead pastor. I continued it. So that every third Wednesday, especially pre-pandemic, don't come into the church office. There are no meetings. Your task alone as a pastor is to spend 8 hours at a park, at a beach, at a coffee shop, praying, reading, reflecting, and then the last couple of hours just planning for the following month and such. Do you know it is so much easier to come into the office and send out emails than to do that? Because after 2 hours, people are thinking, all right, I prayed. What else is there to do, And what we said is, no, stick with it. Do not send out emails. Do not work on a sermon. This is your time to slow down, to be with God. Now, I'm the one who has really continued to deepen this value. And yet when that third Wednesday comes, I'm very tempted to go without it. Now, I'm the one who's like the cheerleader of it. Hey guys, we got to do it. But I'm regularly tempted to go without it. But because I know we're doing it as a community, because I know this is the kind of culture we've established, I need that surrounding culture and that surrounding community to help me to say yes to those particular rhythms. And so, yes, I mean, by all means, if someone has the discipline, I mean, I think you should do it. But I think the larger aspect, we need entire churches and communities and cultures which normalize slowing down, which normalizes this kind of contemplative rhythms. Because apart from that, the world is just too seductive in its pace and in its values for us. And so we just need a larger community. This is what the monastic community has learned over the many centuries, that to be a monk is not just to have a life with God alone. We need to be part of a larger community that's holding on to these rhythms and keeping us grounded together.
Wow, that's amazing. Folks, the book is called The Deeply Formed Life. And Rich, bro, I wish we had like 3 hours just to unpack some of this stuff. It's such good conversation and such good material. But it's been a joy to have you on the show. And man, I do hope we could see you back here on campus at Lee University at some point. I know we would love to have you, but thank you again so much. And as we love to say here, oh wait, I almost forgot the last question. Like Jeff would have annihilated me. This is embarrassing. Hey, we got one more question. Okay, it's a question we ask everybody on the show, and I almost forgot it. So here's the question. What is one lesson you learned in college that took place outside of the classroom?
One lesson that I learned in college
that took place outside of the classroom.
Oh, that's I'll try to capture this in a nutshell. I learned that God speaks in very clear ways in this moment in college that people are listening to. When I was 21, 22 years old, I was in a leadership and administration class, and we were talking about styles of leadership. Mm-hmm. And I never forgot where I was sitting when the professor said, one style of leadership is taking what someone has kind of established and building on it and creating larger systems and helping to flourish. And the image was Paul planted, Apollos watered. So it was like that Apollos watered thing. God spoke to me so deep in my soul. I saw that's who I am. While all my other friends were planting churches, I knew I'm not called to plant the church. This is who I am. And so I learned that lesson about myself. And it was until that moment came when I was asked to take over for Pete at New Life Fellowship Church that I never forgot how God speaks to us at that age. And so for those listening who are in college, the Lord gives dreams and visions. Yeah. The Lord speaks prophetically. And I think there's some things that are, some of it can be attributed to our own hubris and ego, like Joseph and his naivete in the book of Genesis, where, all of you are going to bow at me. And it was like, brother, that wasn't the right time to say that. And some of that is in us, but at the same time, the Lord speaks as well and gives us dreams and visions. And so I learned, hold on to those words that the Lord speaks, because you're going to need them at some other point in your life.
That's awesome. Hey, now I can officially end the show. This is what happens when you leave me by myself. Like my ADD goes off the charts and I forget things. So it's all good. Rich, man, again, it's been a joy to have you on the show. And as we do say here at the Leadership Drip, bro, you've always got a seat at the table.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Hey friends, thanks for listening to this episode of the Leadership Drip. We loved having you at the table for this conversation. Would you do us a favor and comment, rate, subscribe, and share on your social media? That way we can get this content to other great leaders. And stay connected with us on Instagram at the Leadership Drip and on Twitter at Leadership Drip. And remember, you have a seat at the table.